All right, this set of notes should go relatively quickly. It's the last little bit of lecture on British society, looking at citizens in the state, where we'll look primarily at social cleavages. We'll look at uh, national identity, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and then we will use this to kind of talk about linkage institutions, which will set you up for your presentations on political parties. So when we talk about social cleavages, for the most part, lines are drawn along signifiers of national identity, and this becomes the challenge with the United Kingdom, right? You're talking about four nations, one crown, and there have been issues that pop up primarily with sovereignty based on national identity, sovereignty based on geographical boundaries that um, really have created some challenges that you've kind of read about through Chapter 8. If we wanted to break down the population of the United Kingdom based on national identity, 77% of citizens of the United Kingdom self-identify as English nationals, 4.5% are Welsh, 7.9% are Scottish, and 2.7% are Northern Irish. And it's kind of the outlying other three groups that have created challenges for the United Kingdom when you look at or talk about kind of issues between elements of the government and the different nations. The two that have kind of created the largest thorn in the side of the UK Parliament would primarily be Scotland and Northern Ireland. You're probably relatively well versed in kind of the recent challenges that have faced the UK in dealing with Scotland. We know that about 2 years ago and change, there was a referendum on whether or not Scotland wanted to dissolve its union from the United Kingdom, or if they wanted to kind of stay as part of that entity. That the stay vote won by a fairly slim margin. It was pretty cool that they lowered suffrage for that vote down to 16 because they thought people throughout multiple generations should be able to vote or offer their kind of participation, so their voice is heard in terms of looking at the long-term future of Scotland. Northern Ireland has also created some issues. In 1949, Ireland became its own independent entity. However, Northern Ireland kind of remained under British control. And from that period, point forward, you've seen a lot of religious violence between Catholics and Protestants. Most of the Catholics are Irish. There are some Protestants in Northern Ireland where you've seen kind of religious violence play its way out. You've seen the IRA active not just on religious matters, but also arguing that the UK should get off, or the British should leave Northern Irish soil. And the goal of the UK has kind of been to be a peace broker between Northern Ireland and the rest of the nation of Ireland. In 1998 is where you started to see a lot of the violence really subside between the Protestants and Catholics in Ireland and Northern Ireland. In April of 1998, we see what's called the Good Friday Agreement, where a devolution agreement is promised to Northern Ireland, where they get a regional parliament where all parties are represented on a proportional basis to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. If we wanted to talk about specific Protestant groups, the two primary Protestant groups in the United Kingdom are Anglicans, which are followers of the Church of England. If you are an Episcopalian in the United States, you are a stone's throw away from Anglican beliefs or kind of the variations of Christianity that are the foundation for the Church of England. And then in Scotland, your primary group are Presbyterian. The video that shows up on this next slide is from TestTube News / Seeker Daily. I don't know which iteration they were when this video was put together. But looking at how social cleavages can spill from one nation to another, this video does kind of a good job talking about what the repercussions would have been if Scotland voted in favor of leaving or dissolving the Act of Union with the United Kingdom. How that would have kind of rolled downhill and impacted Italy, Spain, Canada, and a handful of other areas. So you should definitely kind of check this out on your own time. It's about 3 minutes long, and I think it offers a lot of interesting insight to how a Scottish vote in favor of leaving would have really impacted the United Kingdom. So the question we need to ask is, in dealing with these social cleavages, the UK has used devolution as a tool of kind of giving more authority or power back to the regional governments or kind of the Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish national government. So the question becomes, have these regional parliaments, have acts of devolution kind of weakened or strengthened social cleavages? And I think you see arguments in favor of kind of both sides, that it's emboldened these social cleavages because you are now giving these individual countries kind of more autonomy to deal with their problems, which might allow the Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish to kind of have a greater sense of fidelity to their nation and not necessarily the UK. But I think for the most part, in terms of lines between the different elements of the United Kingdom, that devolution has been part and parcel pretty successful in terms of kind of quelling some difference in terms of devolution agreements created under Tony Blair in 1997 and 1998, up to the devolution agreement kind of championed by Cameron after Scotland votes in favor of staying part of the United Kingdom. When you want to talk about other identity factors that are not tied to national identity in sense of the four nations, one crown of the UK, it's looking at the experience of immigrant populations. About 7.1% of the British population are non-European immigrants or non-European ethnic minorities. And you can see kind of the tie to the old trappings of the British Empire and who exactly is showing up or kind of immigrating to the United Kingdom. The largest ethnic minority by far are people from the Republic of India. That Indians are 23% of the minority population as of a couple years ago. Just behind them, also kind of from the Indian subcontinent, are Pakistani. 12.2% are Afro-Caribbean, and then 10.5% are Black. You started to see a lot of the minority ethnic population kind of grow between 1991 and 2001 for a variety of reasons. But what you also start to see is after 2004, you see a wave of Eastern European immigrants move into the United Kingdom because of new nations joining the European Union. If you're not familiar, the European Union kind of has an open borders policy among citizens of EU nations, and a lot of people decided to move to the United Kingdom because of a stable economy, because of stable jobs, for a litany of other reasons. So they picked up in around 2004 about 1 million Eastern European immigrants. And if you want to talk about the largest group of foreign nationals who are of any kind of non-UK or non-British origin, it's actually the Poles, that people from Poland have moved to the UK in mass, looking for better jobs, and that they have had so large of an impact that actually the second most spoken language in the United Kingdom is Polish. It's been this wave of migration across Europe, or immigration from individuals from outside of Europe, that has sparked some feelings of nationalism. It's kind of woken pockets of like racism or Islamophobia and made them kind of larger on the surface instead of kind of boiling underground. And as the UK or the European Union took on a policy of kind of filtering refugees from the Middle East or North Africa throughout UK countries, that's where a lot of people in the UK said that they didn't want to participate in the European Union anymore because they did not want to take on all of these new refugees or migrants. In terms of talking about how successful ethnic minorities have been at integrating into the society of the UK, it's really a mixed bag, where ethnic minorities are cited that they are seeing diminished opportunities in terms of access to education, access to jobs, segregated housing or areas of communities, that they've seen physical harassment, they've seen police harassment, police brutality, that they've been marginalized in several different ways. But the other side of the coin is interesting, that if you wanted to look of the kind of upper echelons of the professional ranks, that individuals of kind of a Pan-Asian ethnic background have had the highest percent chance of being successful, and they are actually the most kind of ethnically represented group in terms of people being in charge of corporations or in large positions of power. Or you see a lot of British South Asians, primarily immigrants from India, who have been successful through a lot of, self-made businesses. Where it will be interesting to kind of look at the struggle of minorities over time is looking at what happens to the youth of this minority population. More than a third of the overall immigrant or ethnic minority population is younger than 16. Half of that population is under 25. And I think if you want to look at possibility for economic or social mobility, or you want to look and see if elements of discrimination kind of eliminate or evolve over time, it will be tracking the plight of kind of that younger half, that millennial-ish half of the kind of ethnic minority population in the United Kingdom. The group that's probably the most persecuted are Muslims, as they are throughout the globe. That's kind of the in vogue group to discriminate against now. But you've seen Pakistani Muslims kind of be the number one target of discrimination throughout the United Kingdom, and I think we should look at some examples of why. First will clearly be the tie to terror attacks, both 9/11, which did not necessarily have a huge direct impact on the United Kingdom, aside from some involvement in the American War on Terror. But the 7/7 attacks probably create kind of the biggest series of open acts of hostility towards Muslims after those attacks. If you're not familiar, on July 7th, 2005, you see a coordinated series of attacks on British transportation, both in forms of subway and buses that are kind of the largest non-IRA form of terrorism that happened on British soil. And in 2005, it would have been in about 7 or 8 years since the violence between the UK and Northern Ireland kind of calmed down, that this was another big attack. And the reason why Pakistani Muslims get targeted is you have 3 young men who are born in the United Kingdom of Pakistani descent who are Muslim, but their parents were immigrants. And you see people blaming kind of the immigrant blood or the Pakistani identity on these acts of terror. And it's easy for the citizens of the United Kingdom, to rationalize these acts of violence since Pakistani Muslims were the ones who attacked them. Given that the UK population is fairly homogenous in terms of looking around and seeing a lot of white individuals, the British Muslims stick out for several different reasons, and it's easy for systemic factors to kind of allow for easier discrimination against Muslims in Britain, where many British Muslims tend to see a higher unemployment rate than Muslim immigrants throughout the rest of the world. A lot of the Muslim immigrants or refugees who have made their way to the United Kingdom have a lower literacy rate because they are children of poor parents who are kind of emigrating in for cheap industrial labor, and education tends to be a low priority. Polling data also suggests that because the Muslim culture has kind of not been effectively absorbed into elements of mainstream UK culture, that they're easy to identify, easy to discriminate, especially when you can see people walking around in hijabs, in traditional dress, and they become easy noticeable targets for discrimination. Ethnicity and national identity are not the only kind of dividing lines. That looking at the UK social class is another kind of big distinction, where we know that the UK had to deal with trappings of the old aristocracy in terms of people accumulating wealth, in terms of noble blood versus everybody else. But post-industrial revolution, we've started to see a larger class division, primarily between the working class and the middle class, and this kind of manifests itself in 2 ways. First, a disproportionate unemployment rate, that if you look at this graphic on the bottom right of the slide, you'll kind of see a red line drawn. That red line creates a north-south divide between, southern England and the rest of the United Kingdom. And if you look at the statistics, that tells you what percent the unemployment rate is in those cities kind of spread out throughout the kingdom. And I think seeing unemployment rate kind of leads to differences in government spending between areas. You can see the difference between like the life expectancy between Cambridge and Liverpool, and that difference of like 4.2 years is something that is kind of staggering when you're looking at life expectancy within one area. The reason why unemployment has kind of exploded is because the UK has kind of shifted to this new technological, new digital economy, where the bulk of the new industry, the bulk of new tech is in the southern portion of England, whereas everywhere else is kind of stuck to traditional manufacturing labor, to procurement of natural resources in terms of like coal mining or timber and that kind of stuff. These economic divisions in social class also create economic divisions in education. In 2015, education becomes compulsory to the age of 18, and there is a national curriculum. And the kind of most important distinction between the lower classes and the elites are your access to, private, what we would consider private high schools and private elite universities versus kind of more traditional public schools. And to kind of highlight the difference that of all members of parliament, about half of the conservatives in parliament went to either Oxford or Cambridge, and a quarter of the member of current Labour MPs. So that's a large portion of the House of Commons that is represented by people who are kind of upper echelon economic or educational elites. To be a member of the cabinet, that percentage of attending, what they would call Oxbridge, which is either Oxford and or Cambridge, is even higher. So there are some economic barriers that really impact kind of a north-south division in the United Kingdom. And I want you to think of this north-south division and be able to compare it to looking at geographic distribution of wealth, income, unemployment, education, or other economic factors as we look at the remaining 5 of our 6 countries. When we talk about political participation or socialization, the 3 large areas or 3 largest agents of socialization in the UK are family, where you see a long-standing tie between people voting for kind of the party of the parents or the party of their economic standing or stature. And that will be a phenomenon that you all kind of explore during your political parties presentations and research. Voting rates are higher in the United Kingdom. That number is at, kind of an all-time low, as you see by looking at the graph, but it's rebounding. And you saw kind of a larger wave of participation that if we were to include on this the 2015 parliamentary election, if we were to include the Brexit vote or the Scottish referendum, that number would probably be considerably higher than where it is now. And, we look at this number and we see that, in the mid-1900s, it was like 83, 85% voter turnout, and now it's, between 60 and 70. That number still puts the United States to shame. In the 2016 presidential election, the voter turnout percentage was something like 49% of eligible voters went out to vote. But we know that political participation is not just voting, that we need to ask the question, are people kind of involved in other elements? But that form of political participation tends to be infinitely lower, especially compared to other kind of advanced democracies throughout the world, that maybe people are willing to rally around particular issues, but the causes tend to be tied to a more specific. So the types of issues that get participated in tend to be far more sporadic than the United States. And there are some big issues that kind of get everybody out for, like when the women's suffrage movement was in full force, you saw a higher active participation when there were discussions on nuclear disarmament. That's happening now. You tend to see people get kind of universally mad or happy about similar issues, but not to kind of the extent of the United States. When we talk about linkage institutions, looking at how these people can become more active, we'll look at political parties, and that's going to be done through your presentations. And one of the questions that you should maybe explore is, you're asked to look at who typically participates in what or which parties. So maybe think of an answer to the question of how do these political parties kind of address social cleavages. When we talk about interest groups, they are a pluralist system, which, remember, that means that there are multiple interest groups that compete to kind of be the peak association or compete for influence with the government, and there's not much government influence. However, on the other hand, there are elements of neo-corporatism in the United Kingdom where you will see the government invite these interest groups to the table for policy making, and I'll give you an article with some examples of that. The last thing in terms of linkage institutions is kind of a new concept to us, which are called quangos. Quangos are quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. So these are organizations that are funded by taxpayers, but they are not controlled directly by the central government. As of a couple years ago, there were over 700 quangos, and these are like state-funded interest groups that have some hoops to jump through because of access to government funding, but they function autonomously. And kind of the big criticism of these groups is that they're expensive and they're not subject to a whole heck of a lot of government control aside from what they have to jump through to get money. These are created by Parliament to kind of put together the government and private interests in terms of making some policy. So a lot of these quangos do things like develop safety regulations for factories. They look at community like proposals on dealing with race, on dealing with infrastructure, a lot of different things. And anybody can kind of serve as part of a quango, right? That civil servants, the people who are working for the bureaucracy in Whitehall, could be an example of someone who works for a quango. Lobbyists from the interest groups described earlier are an example, and even members of the government can be part of these quangos. So it's kind of an interesting fusion of public and private interests funded through public dollars. You've seen kind of a push since 2010 to eliminate some of these quangos to save money and to kind of reform the size and scope of the influence of these groups. So there's less money kind of wasted in that direction. The last thing that we need to look at are kind of British values, and I'll leave these slides up here for a couple of seconds, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more in class after you do your presentations on political parties, so we can see how these political parties kind of speak to values of a variety of British citizens. There are two last videos that show up at the bottom of this set of notes that you should check out on your own. The first one is another kind of Seeker Daily / Test Tube News video that highlights life in the United Kingdom, where you can kind of look at the average British experience. And then the last thing is there are two clips from John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, one before the Brexit vote happens, one after the Brexit vote happens, because the next thing that we're going to transition into talking about is the the European Union. And I still don't know how much I want to or need to talk about the European Union, because very much so the UK is part of the EU, right? That the Brexit vote only was a public referendum to say we need to get out. As you're listening to this, Parliament is still kind of figuring out their plan for invoking Article 50, which is the leave clause to get them out of the EU. There's been a new reinvigorated debate about whether or not Britain should actually leave because of the new kind of found cost to the UK. You've seen talk about whether or not the House of Lords will use their legislative power to kind of delay Brexit for up to a year once the kind of proposal starts working through the process to become an act of parliament. And this will, I think, do a good job of kind of getting you set up for a discussion of the European Union.